Welcome back to the Strength Connect podcast. In today's episode, I was joined by Steve Hall. Steve is the host of the Revive Stronger podcast. And in today's episode, we spoke about Steve's story and how Revive Stronger was born. We also touched on his most recent bodybuilding prep, some of the pain management strategies that he's employed in his own training. We ranked a list of different dieting foods, and we discussed whether you can shock or confuse muscles into growth. As we've done in a number of the different introductory episodes to this podcast series, we discussed the RIR research and training to failure as well. This podcast is brought to you by VPA Australia Supplements. If you'd like to save 10% off your order, you can use my code Hayden10 or the link in the show notes. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Steve. I feel very fortunate to obviously have you on and chat all things bodybuilding. I've seen a little bit of the recent bodybuilding season you've had and been watching your updates. Also, plenty of those YouTube videos that you share. Not only the podcast itself, Revive Stronger, but a lot of those shorter clips where you go through a whole host of different topics, which I want to unpack a little bit more today about some of those insights that you have that you want to share with the listeners of the Strength Connect podcast. And so in my perspective, I think the best way to kick things off would just be to get more of an insight about where Revive Stronger all started, because I know it's been a podcast that's been around for a long time. I think I did my first bodybuilding show back in 2017. And even at that point, around then, I think you were growing. You've got a big Facebook community as well. So that's kind of ship has sailed Facebook. So no doubt you were there in those early stages where you're able to build a community around Revive Stronger. But tell the listeners about what Revive Stronger is about if they're not aware, and how it all came about.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate you following for that length of time. And yeah, it's crazy to think now I've been at this essentially a decade full-time online coaching and doing kind of content and production like that. So in terms of Revive Stronger, long story short, I suffered a head injury on a run whilst I was at university. At this time, I wasn't in any particular sport to a high level, and I was spreading myself very thinly across running. I was going to the gym. I tried my hand at rowing club, running club, playing football, soccer, trying all these different things. And I just love being active. That's always been the way I am. I love being active, pushing myself. I hadn't chosen like bodybuilding's my thing. I'm going to go down this route. And when I was at university, I was studying geography of business. So this was completely unspecific towards personal training or anything like that. I didn't even take any physical education to a higher level. It was all done like it just, I always enjoyed it, but it never kind of sung to me in that way. So I always partook in it, but I was also like a bit of a tangent. I was bullied at school, and a lot of like the jocks were the people bullying me, and I just wanted to get away from that sort of thing. So yeah, it was never like a dream or passion of mine to be where I am sat today, and that isn't where I saw myself going. But when I was on this run, without getting too distracted, I do this run like at least every week. It was like a 10-kilometer run around campus, and I remember wearing my Garmin watch and my Garmin like heart rate monitor. I had all the gear, and I was trying to every time do this run and beat my last time's best performance. You had like a shadow runner on your watch, and you could see your last time where you were and how far ahead of him you were. So I always remember just looking at this and like, I'm going to beat it. I'm going to beat it. And I came to some traffic lights. They're flashing amber, which means you shouldn't really cross. But I kind of was like, hey, I'm on good time here. I was really close back to my apartment where I was living, and I went for it, looked right, and this van hit me. And unfortunately, I was then in hospital for about a month at this point with some short-term injuries. Like I have some scarring on my elbow, on my back, had a concussion and a fractured skull. But the issue was the head injury led me to having a bruised They think hypothalamus, pituitary, something in the head that was controlling various hormones, which left me in just a bad state. I was in hospital for a month because I was at risk of seizuring due to having incredibly low sodium levels. My body it was like a camel holding on to all fluids, but not sodium. If your electrolyte balance gets too out of whack, you can cause yourself big problems. I always laugh because people at university used to have this kind of game they do where they drink as much water as possible, and they'd go into the same issue as I would have, and they'd have to go into hospital because they were essentially drowning themselves. So anyway, I eventually recovered from that. I actually also had low testosterone levels, which I was prescribed TRT for a short course that I needed to kind of recover me from that as well. And thankfully now I've been off any medication and stuff for over 10 years. At the time of recovery, I didn't want to go back to my previous sports and endeavors. I was on a fluid restriction of 250 mils a day, which was horrendously small. And I could make that through just like having some soup or like some milk in some cereal. Like, by accident, I could easily overdose. And so I found the gym was like the mainstay of what would provide me control, and I'd feel confident in there. I'd also lost any muscle mass that I had gained during my time in hospital because I wasn't eating, I wasn't moving. So I was incredibly skinny. So I started just trying to learn a bit better, learn more. And I initially did like one of the worst things you can probably do, but I think we all fall into that trap of thinking, or hopefully not so much now, especially listeners to this podcast. It's like, oh, just eat all the clean food and I'll gain clean weight. And I was just looking to gain weight as quick as I could. I remember really pounding back the food. I was trying to gain like a good 6-7 pounds like on a week to week basis if I could. I was like, if I wasn't gaining that, I wanted to be gaining more. I was like, more weight gain the better. It's all great food. And I was just kind of quote unquote training hard in the gym. And this was advice from like forums online because we didn't have great information at that time. That was like 2010, 2011. So there really wasn't like an evidence space, particularly at this time. So anyway, I went through that. I kind of gained all the weight and did it the wrong way and tried to go through like warrior diets and keto diets, like burn it off. And I wasn't understanding principles. I was just following programs and I didn't know what was working for them. It was just a case of, hey, I'm just going to push myself hard at this. And it did prove to me, if you push yourself hard at any diet, at any training, you're going to see some results. It's just probably not going to be the best result. So after going through that, I was like, oh man, there's got to be a better way to do this. So I started to try and like learn more, research on the internet more. I came across Matt Ogus, who led me to 3DMJ through Eric Helms, who was his coach. And he was also doing his natural bodybuilding prep at the time. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I want to do that. That is the thing. And I really wanted to do this natural bodybuilding prep because it was to not convince myself. I never felt fully recovered from the accident. I always felt like, man, what could I do to make myself feel confident that I'm recovered from that? Even though I'm off all medication, I'm in the best shape that I've been in. What can I do? And it was to do a show. I was like, that's an extreme thing to put your body through to get to those lean levels and then recover from it. Let's see if I can do that. And if I can do that, I can feel fairly confident that I can do anything. Almost. That's kind of the way I was looking at it. That was my why. And so in 2014, I did my first bodybuilding prep. It went all right. I didn't do amazingly, but I got into great shape. I got like lines in my butt and I recovered from that too. And at the same time, because I was learning so much about evidence-based practice, coming across people like Lyle McDonald, reading bodyrecomposition.com, and I was obsessed with it. And I found it fascinating just how plastic the human body can be if you put in the right inputs. And so on going through that, I realized I wanted to become probably part of the industry. So I had my office job that I was doing, but on the weekends I would do a personal training qualification. So I became qualified. And so that same year, definitely a terrible combination, I became a one-on-one PT at my local gym. I quit my job and I was living at home. So it was kind of risk-free in that sense. I didn't have to worry about expenditures as much. And so I became a one-on-one PT, same time doing my first prep. And I went through that. But interestingly enough, and this is where I'm going to get to about Revive Stronger, is there was kids, I call them kids. They were kids at the time, but there was guys who were like a year or two younger than me in the local gym, and they saw me transform my physique. They also saw me focusing on compound lifts and progressive overload and getting stronger at these things. I had the nickname Compound Guy because at the time it just wasn't a thing to focus on like big compound lifts and progressive overload. It was kind of like novel and new in a gym environment back then. Now it's like so normal, but the education just wasn't there back then. And so I would talk to them about, hey, there's this thing called flexible dieting. I have macros I'm trying to achieve. And yeah, I can basically eat what I quote unquote want within reason. As long as I'm in a calorie deficit, I'm going to lose the body fat. And as long as I train progressively within the gym, I'm going to maintain or grow muscle. And they're like, wow, I've got to do this. So I started actually coaching people online for like smallest amount of money. It was £30, I think I was charging per month at the time, which is like, you would never get an online coach for that amount now, basically. It just isn't going to happen. And so I would get transformations with these guys and they'd get good results because they would really just like, teenagers at that sort of age, if they put in effort and time and they're kind of newbies as well, like they saw such good results. And I loved doing that. And I love being behind almost like a desk and programming and getting into the analysis and doing all of that sort of thing. And I didn't have the energy for the one-on-one PT so much because I was in prep. So I started growing this online business. So much so when I completed my prep and the next year I reduced my one-on-one hours and went online. And this is where I branded myself Revive Stronger. And that name comes from the fact that I had that accident where I basically got into the worst shape of my life ever and built myself back up to be a stronger individual just through that process of, wow, being at like ground zero, essentially getting into the best shape of my life. If I can do that under like some pretty poor circumstances, I feel confident I can help others. And then I started gaining the experience with other people around me. And that's where what birthed Revive Stronger, as it were, and my passion for bodybuilding and I guess changing your body composition.
It's amazing how so many bodybuilders that you hear of have this precursor to their journey in fitness or resistance training, bodybuilding. We spoke to Brandon Kempter. It was quite funny. We were talking to him about his background on the farm and just lifting, whatever he could make use of in and around the farm, whether it be, water drums or whatever it may be, dips on the back of a chair. But for yourself, even for me as well, I guess I had an injury during cricket where I dislocated my thumb. I had an operation, and in that time, I obviously couldn't play cricket. And so I turned my hand to increasing my frequency of gym-based sessions and predominantly lower limb. Like I remember just stacking up the leg press and week after week after week with that periodized progressive overload, saw the changes that were occurring within my body. So as my quadriceps were developing and I guess how compact and strong my knees and hips felt was again a precursor for me ultimately quitting cricket or representative cricket and going and focusing on doing bodybuilding shows. And there's something about locking yourself in to a consistent program and seeing the results over time. And we've talked about this on the podcast, but it's such a empowering feeling. I think that's the word. And this is something that you've felt through being not only able to empower yourself through your own rehabilitation, but empower others through your coaching. How do people get in touch with you if they're interested in taking some of your services?
I just want to touch on your point there. I completely agree. That accident was a time in my life where I felt completely out of control of my body. And in many ways, I think when you feel out of control of your body, you feel out of control of your life. And I felt it. I don't like that sense. Feeling out of control is one of the worst feelings possible. And I was like, I have to be careful with what I eat, what I drink. I have to rely on this medication. How is my body going to recover? When I wasn't on bits of medication, I was in like severe, like when I was in a low testosterone state, like severely low, I built up gynecomastia. And that's how I discovered it in the end. And I had depression basically. And like my mood was terrible. And so like having gone through all of that and then come out of it, like finding, like I said, when you feed the body the right nutrition, you give it the sleep it needs, the right program and training and fatigue management, like it just ends up like a flower that has been in the shade and hasn't been watered, it suddenly is like growing flowers and it is flourishing. It's an amazing feeling. And then it's the same with coming across evidence-based kind of content and approaches, knowing how to get that flower to flourish as effectively and efficiently as possible. And you're confident, hey, I'm giving it the right amount of fluids. I haven't hydrated it. I haven't underhydrated it. I'm not giving it excess sun. It's not getting burned. It's actually flourishing now. And being able to then do that for other people, like, because I know the amount of confidence that not just it gave in me in my physique, but then in the rest of my life. And it taught me so much in terms of, hey, be skeptical of things you hear, seek out evidence, like see it in real time. How am I responding? There's individual differences. So yeah, I love that. And to be able to give that to someone else is a huge passion of mine. So yeah, for our services, very simple, revivestronger.com is where our website is. And then people can find our online coaching on there. And yeah, I've been doing that, like I said, now for essentially a decade. And coaching is my bread and butter. It's what I do the majority of my day. And I absolutely love it. And to see the change in people physically, but also mentally has been amazing. I'm sure you're the same.
And one of those things you've been talking about was just like you use that analogy of a flower or a garden and watering the garden and seeing how it, the produce of your efforts. You said for a period of time, your progress has probably stalled due to a number of different things within your training that have kind of held you back a little bit. But recently, your thought process around execution within the gym and the stimulus that you're putting your muscles under has really improved. And there were some of these principles that you talked about in a recent video. And one of those was kind of around, I guess, the failure terminology and how it's utilized. Obviously, we hear a lot of different terms like, technical failure, volitational failure, mechanical failure. One of those examples you might use would be, the quadriceps with a heavy compound barbell back squat versus, say, a leg extension where you've got a bit more external stability, or if you're doing a sissy squat and you're kind of assisted, which I saw some variations of you performing on Instagram, which was quite cool. And I've actually started to incorporate with the cable where you're holding the cable attachment and doing the sissy squats. But obviously what you were saying before there about how when you were growing up or sort of coming out of your injury that you sustained, a lot of the focus wasn't around compound-based movements. Whereas I feel now in the current context, there seems to be a large shift back towards machine-based weights and making use of that external stability. So how much has that actually helped you with, I guess, regaining control over your progress from the context of you actually being able to drive stimulus into a target muscle and achieve failure or close to failure?
Yeah, really cool. So this makes me think of what I discussed before, where when I first got into the gym and with my diet as well, I would follow diets, I would follow programs, and I wouldn't understand the principles that were driving results. And so I couldn't individualize it to me, which is fine when you're first starting out because anything works when you put effort into it. And this is the same here with some of the principles I would hear with like technical failure and, I don't know, I was under the impression free weights were superior to machines for the longest time. And for big quads, you have to barbell back squat. And that again was just hearing sound bites. Hey, barbell back squats are best for quad growth. It wasn't understanding why they might be best for quad growth and then being able to be skeptical and be like, hey, similar to why, hey, I don't have to eat tilapia to get really lean to stage. If the macros are the same for chicken breast and I prefer chicken breast, hey, maybe I digest it better. Well, brilliant. I'm going to go with the chicken breast, what have you. And it's similar here with our barbell back squat. Why would it train the quads well? Oh, okay, we're getting a nice amount of knee flexion and good amount of stretch under load. But a hack squat, but I've got this added stability here. Maybe I can push that quad closer to failure. Maybe I can get more knee flexion and remove more of the glutes from that movement. And so once I started to think about it from that approach, that have really helped open my eyes a little bit towards, hey, maybe we can use some more of these machine-based movements. And it's just that logical basis of, again, people like to hate against maybe like an iliac pull down. And I understand where they're coming from because everyone's doing it now, right? We're doing it for years where it's that pulling the cable down, neutral grip position, elbow to pocket. It's like we're trying to bias the lower lat. But when I think about it and I boil it down, like it's a vertical pull. It's not that different to just doing a lat pull down single arm. It's pretty much almost the same, in fact. So if I'm training that hard proximal to failure, it's just another vertical pull down variation. It's another tool in the toolbox, and I will not remove tools. And that's one of my biggest philosophies is we have so many tools in our toolbox as a bodybuilder. Don't restrict yourself needlessly because of, I don't know, you're a bro old school bodybuilder who has to barbell back squat, has to just do pull-ups, and you're therefore not going to do this iliac biased pull down variation, even though maybe your lower lats haven't had any degree of kind of particular tension through them. So I think it's just framing it the right way for the individual at hand and making sure that you, again, don't remove tools. And then to talk about the failure piece, because again, this is one of those ones where I said evidence-based practice and understanding some of these things on a deeper level can be really helpful. But there's a difference between understanding it from like a textbook element versus like a practical standpoint. And sometimes you can go too far into the textbook and be like, all right, so technical failure, like that's when we feel like we're going to break down technique. That's failure, right? But we didn't really have a good understanding of what good technique is. So in my eyes, back when I first was hearing this, was like any deviation in technique meant technique breakdown. But when I think about it now, and we have better understanding of what good technique is from an evidence-based perspective, because Dr. Pack kind of came out with his paper and I had him on my podcast to talk about, actually, there's really broad ranges of what acceptable good technique is. You don't have to have these like super slow eccentrics and pausing, and a little bit of momentum might not even be a bad thing depending on the context. Whereas in my head, it was like, if my knees just cave in a little bit on like a hack squat, squat, or if it slows down a little bit on my concentric on a leg extension, like I'm failing at this point.
Yeah.
And if in fact, that's like 4 reps in reserve, like at that stage. And so given the literature that came out, especially with Zach Robinson and colleagues and his meta-analysis and meta-regression on as you get proximal, the closer to failure you get, the more growth you get almost exponentially. And of course, this was lots of caveats. It was in like low volume studies and things like this. But I still think that relationship holds for the majority of people on the majority of lifts. And obviously it doesn't make sense in every context, but I'm like, hey, it's from when I boil everything down, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get a muscle close to failure. And I come back to that barbell back squat versus hack squat scenario. If I'm in a hack squat, it's far safer to fail, and I'm more likely to fail because of my quads versus my lower back giving out or something like that. So then when I think about it like that, I'm like, hey, I could make an argument a hack squat is superior for quad hypertrophy than actually a barbell back squat. I think both can be used and probably should be used by a lot of people. Yeah, when I try and think about the fundamentals of what's truly driving growth within muscle tissue, it made me reassess technical failure. I have a broader stroke for what that breakdown would look like. I'm therefore really focused on the prime driver for growth in that sort of context is getting the target muscle tissue as close to failure as you can. So picking movements that allow you to do that, picking a technique that allows you to do that, unlocked some new growth for me for sure.
And the fatigue cost, I guess, the closer you get to failure. So going from you training for RIR to now coming closer to that 1 to 2, even reaching failure, what have you started to learn now about, I guess, the fatigue cost that comes with training in this manner? Have you varied your training volume, your intensity in any way?
Great question, because this leads me to a trap that I got into was, in addition to understanding technical failure, and we don't want technique to break down, it's really important for form to look very pretty, and I attached an ego to that. I was also obviously up to date with the literature of, we see a dose response in volume on hypertrophy. The more volume you can do and recover from, the more growth you get. So this would lead me to do horrendous levels of volume. And that also led me to have even less intensity within every set, because going into a session, I would see sometimes there'll be 10 up to 20 sets for a muscle group. Man, there's no way someone's doing those to like a really good high degree of effort, especially if you then have that amount for other muscle groups as well. And you could have 50 plus set within a whole session there. So it led to my quality and my effort even going down. So now getting that in place, my volume is much, much lower, and my efficiency within sessions is just far better. And my volume's not low by any means. I think if you were to look at what I was doing now, you'll be like, hey, you're a pretty moderate volume guy. Most of my muscle groups are probably sitting around 15 sets for upper body, up towards 20 sets per muscle per week, whereas lower body is much closer to like 10, which is like, again, within that accepted evidence-based range, which makes sense. I'm an average guy, and that's the average kind of recommendation. So it suits a lot of people. But yeah, I had moments where I'd be driving that volume as high as I could, but I could do that because the stimulus I was getting and the fatigue I was getting on the other side was so little, because I wasn't really getting much of either. Whereas now the stimulus is much greater. There is that fatigue cost, but fatigue is nothing to be scared of. It's part of the process of getting that stimulus. So it's kind of the cost of doing business. You can't, I think that's what a lot of people get wrong with stimulus to fatigue ratios. They're like, all I want is stimulus, and fatigue I do not want. So anything that drives high levels of fatigue, get rid of it. It's like, probably if it's driving high levels of fatigue, you're also driving high levels of stimulus. Vice versa. If you're not getting much stimulus, yeah, you're probably not getting much fatigue. But it's like, you pick your poison in that sense. And really, you just want to avoid, it wants to be decisions like, hey, a barbell back squat, it annoys my hips and my knees a little bit. I get a good quad pump, but my knees and hips. Whereas a hack squat, hey, I get all the quads, no hip and knee issues. Well, that's kind of the SFR that I'd be looking at. Hey, that makes sense for then using the hack squat in that scenario. It's not a case of, oh, when I do leg extensions and I leave 4 reps in reserve, all I feel is my quads. I have to do 20 sets of them to get any sort of like stimulus going on, but the fatigue is really low. So yeah, but how long did that take you? How efficient is that when you could have done a couple of sets of hard hack squats to maybe get a better bang per buck in that scenario? So yeah, that's kind of where my standpoint is there.
So obviously deloads are a big consideration when it comes to fatigue management, and the general consensus, which you've spoken about amongst Eric Helms, Mike Israetel, and these prolific researchers within the space, has been around auto-regulating your deloads. So I guess how has that changed now? Again, looking back to, say, time in your life when you were sort of doing those 4 RIRs, and as soon as your technique broke down, you were switching, or you're terminating the set, or maybe switching exercises, whatever it may be. Now you see deloads as more of a tool in your toolkit, which you can utilize to continue to progress with your training and manage, as we say, fatigue and the training stress. In the past, you've been open about the fact that you only really called a deload when your training turned to shit. So whether it be, you weren't performing the same amount of volume week to week, or the intensity was dropping off, or you were getting tired or more fatigued. But now you've sort of started to implement these deloads more frequently. Would I be right in saying?
Not really.
Again, I'll chop this up. Yeah.
No, it's fine. My kind of understanding of deloads has been the same for years, but my implementation of them has changed a little bit. But that's because of the other things that I've changed, where I am making sure I'm taking muscles closer to failure and I'm not running as high volumes for the sake of high volumes. I'm looking for more sustainable long-term progress over what's going to drive the most progress here and now today, because they're very different. If you were to say, hey, I want to drive as much hypertrophy in my quads today, I basically do as many sets as I could possibly do with feeling like they were productive and I wasn't using the lightest weights possible. But then I'm probably not going to be able to train my quads for like a week, two, because they're going to be so beat up and sore and destroyed. That's not going to be productive. So I want to do enough today so then I can then progress that next time and they can recover on time. So previously, and I had actually a great roundtable with Menno, Eric Helms, and Mike Israetel. I forget when it was, like 2017, 18, on deloads. And they essentially came to that conclusion of they should be auto-regulated. This one then got really reinforced with the paper from Max Coleman, where they looked at 9-week block of training. One group went 9 weeks just all the way through. The others, after 4 weeks, had that 1 week just off, and then 4 weeks. And they saw the same results. And it was like, some people took that as just like, oh, you don't need to deload. Some people were like, oh, you can train 1 week less and still get the same results, basically. And it truly wasn't a deload because it was a week off the gym versus going in there and doing some light training, which is typically what most people would do with a deload. But it kind of made people think about whether or not they truly need a deload again, and not just taking it for the sake of it. Because when people were taking that in the study, they're like, I don't need it. I don't feel like I need to do it. Even the group after 9 weeks were like, I feel fine. And of course, they weren't like super well trained lifters, but they were doing quite a lot of volume. And so anyway, when I come back to my philosophies with training, is I used to try and really push my volume to like its maximal amount. And this actually led to just essentially unsustainable training, where it was like, I can't repeat this week's performance because it's just so much. My sessions would take 2 hours plus, and I was just fatiguing myself. I'd like force an overreach period essentially. Whereas now I let the accumulative fatigue come to me. So I would have like a programmed in my fifth week, it'd be like a programmed deload. And I'd always think, oh, I'm letting that come to me and I just always need it at that point. But in reality, in that fifth week, I would really push lots of volume, and I forced myself to get into a position where I was like, yeah, this is unsustainable. I have to then deload and then rinse and repeat. Whereas now I don't push so much set volume week to week. I get to an amount that I'm like, this is really productive. It's very challenging. I'm just about recovering on time for sessions. And I essentially milk that out for as long as I can until fatigue gets to a point where it's like my motivation to train is dropping off. My performance is really just like wavering a little bit. It's like it's just about plateaued, or it's dropping off in some areas. Joint and connective tissue is feeling a bit funky. My sleep is a little bit worse. I need more of it as well. And so at that point, I'm like, I'll back off, because now that accumulative fatigue is impacting my performance and what I'm getting out of my sessions. And now I'll even auto-regulate the length of the deload. So rather than taking just a full week blanket, hey, I need a week deload because that's the deload, right? I'll take anywhere from 3, often it's 3 to 5 days of either just completely off, or I'll do a couple of light sessions just to kind of keep some blood flow, keep some kind of fitness characteristics, and then I'll get back into training again. So I'm more so focused on just trying to train as hard as I can for as long as I can, and not so concerned about doing as much as I can in the short term and forcing an reaching period, which I don't think we have good evidence to suggest you need to force an overreach for optimal hypertrophy. And especially if that means you then need to take so much time away, and it means that your kind of accumulation periods are shorter. So now my deloads are actually, recently they've been like every 8th week, versus previously they were every like 6th week, or sometimes they're every 9th week. And that's even whilst I'm dieting as well. So I just like to get to this kind of very sweet spot of training intensity is very close to failure. It's like 0 to 1 RER. And then my volume is at a really nice level where I'm like, this is very challenging. I'm just about recovering on time. And then I'll hold that for as long as I can, kind of running this very potent stimulus for growth until a deload, that accumulative fatigue essentially catches up to me, where I'm like, yeah, I need to pull back here. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah. And with the muscles, say like the biceps, biceps, calves, triceps, more distal to, say, your chest, quadriceps. I guess they've got a higher fatigue cost if you're doing heavy compound movements that are focusing on those big prime movers like the quadriceps for a back squat or pectorals for a bench press, say, particularly if you're going to, say, one RIR. If you're working with these smaller muscle groups, do you kind of change the volume or the training structure around different sessions for different body parts, depending on how much fatigue you're going to accumulate with these different muscle groups? And do you also vary rep ranges?
For sure. So yeah, it's not like I follow 10 sets for, say, every muscle group through the week. It's very individualized to the person, but also to that muscle group. And then so for example, for me, my arms in terms of direct work get very little volume. I often joke that someone might look at a piece of content of me, and if I was to tell them how I grow big arms, it's never, as a coach, I know that's never how I'd recommend someone else grow big arms, because they're a genetic strength to me. They don't need much, and that's why I'm doing so little. They grow almost through just my pulling and pressing. So I very much put those on the back burner, and they always last within sessions. But I pretty much always take those to 0, 1 RAR and just kind of hold it there, knowing that that's probably at least minimum effective stimulus for them to keep growing, and they're not a priority for me. But delts, because I am not the broadest individual, my clavicle width isn't super wide, my waist is wider, and as a bodybuilder, symmetry is super important. As you know, my delts, my side delts specifically, I need to put a lot of work through them. They're at the start of sessions, and I will work up the set volume to a point where I'm like, that feels very challenging. I'm still being able to perform well set to set. And again, I'll take those pretty close to failure too, because I do think, and that's something I've changed my philosophy on. I used to think there was just a general RER that made sense for like muscles in general in terms of to optimize hypertrophy. Like around a 2 RER might be the average that's best in terms of stimulus to fatigue trade-off. But as you all know, like taking a set of leg press to 2 RER is very different to taking a set of calves, biceps, whatever it might be, isolation movement to 2 RER. And so I'm much more willing and will on average train much closer to failure for these smaller muscle groups that just to be able to seem to be able to take it. It doesn't really fatigue you anymore systemically. Whereas for like big compound leg movements, I can't consistently train that close to failure. Otherwise my volume would be very low. It starts really fatiguing me. The stimulus fatigue trade-off is really poor in those sort of scenarios. So yeah, it's very individual, muscle to muscle, exercise to exercise in terms of RAR prescription, and then volume prescription too. And yes, I do undulate rep ranges through the week. That's something that I think is really helpful. I think that's where kind of daily undulating periodization comes in terms of it's more of a programming tool than like a periodization tool, where because you can sort of attack different areas, like you undulate exercises across the week, so you can train slightly different areas of muscle group by using slightly different rep ranges. It sort of, I guess, in some ways stimulates and disrupts the muscle in a slightly different way. Those lower rep ranges can be really effective, but the higher rep ranges you can kind of use as another effective tool. Whereas if you were just going heavy all the time or light all the time, it might not be quite as synergistic as using the two together. So again, that comes back to like tools in a toolbox. Use them as like cleverly as you can to try and stimulate muscles as much as you can without that kind of excess fatigue cost. So yeah, I'll undulate reps across the week quite a bit, especially if I'm using the same exercise for a muscle group.
On the topic of, I guess, volume, reps, sets, we had a question come through on Instagram recently, and this was, I think she was a figure competitor, and her question was around sacrificing reps in the context of a bodybuilding prep, because the next part of the conversation that I want to get into is a little bit of a chat about your most recent bodybuilding preparation phase. But the question was more so around, is it best to sacrifice reps to maintain weight as you're getting closer towards the stage and you're dropping body weight, and inevitably sometimes we do lose a bit of strength as our body weight declines and the calories are, or the amount of food we're consuming is reduced. Is it better to sacrifice reps for weight or vice versa? What would be your take on that?
Great question. Yeah, I think this is one that I don't think we have I don't have like a paper that I can refer someone to and be like, see, if you drop reps and you keep the load, then here you maintain muscle mass better. I don't think we're probably ever going to have anything that's specific towards like bodybuilders at the end of prep, what's going to maintain muscle best. But when I think about this question, I think about it from a muscle growth perspective, because I think what built the muscle the best will maintain the muscle the best. And when I think about what would build the muscle the best, I would think about, hey, we need to do sets proximal to failure. That's the stimulus for growth. It doesn't matter so much if they're high reps, lower load, or low reps, higher load. And so in this scenario, I would be guiding the person with with SFR. So I say, hey, if keeping that heavy load, how's it feeling on your like joints, connective tissue psychologically? Does it feel very wearing to kind of maintain that load and let your reps drop off? How does that feel to you? Like, does that feel like I don't know, some people feel real bad about that, like letting those reps drop off. They feel like they're getting, well, they're getting weaker, but if they're not necessarily getting objectively weaker from like a Wilks standpoint or a strength to body weight ratio, they could still be actually be in a better place than when they started prep because they're so much lighter. Or does it feel better to reduce the load maybe 10-20% and maybe let your reps maintain, or well, hopefully if you reduce by 20% you'd even get higher reps. So I'd say it's like a pick your poison. The most important thing is you're still proximal to failure, so you're generating that stimulus through that muscle. Whether or not you reduce load and maintain reps or keep the load the same and drop your reps, I don't think totally matters. It happened to me recently, in fact, and I decided the best thing for me to do was actually to reduce load a little bit, because I know I tend to do better with slightly higher reps. Even deeper in prep, where I thought from a physiological perspective, I'm more depleted, so I don't have as much glycogen available for higher reps, I still see my body seems to like the higher reps. I get less joint connective tissue fatigue. The muscle feels more stimulated. So I'm a very pick your poison. You're not going to be able to, I don't think it matters too much which route you go down.
It was an interesting point you made there, because relatively speaking, say you've lost 10 plus kilos and you're still pushing the same weight. If you are, say, dropping a rep or two towards the back end of a prep, or, 5 kilos or whatever it may be, relatively speaking, you're probably actually stronger than you were when you started. So if you get kind of stuck on those absolute weights and you're not looking at things from a relative perspective as like per pound of body weight, per kilo weight lifted, it can really fuck with your head a bit, I think. So yeah, definitely one of those things where I think RPE is definitely a great strategy just to get an idea of your perceived exertion and how that correlates to the weight being lifted. And I'm on a similar kind of perspective with you in terms of if I do drop weight or start to drop reps, and towards the back end of prep, just getting that additional blood flow through the muscle and, starting to work into some higher volume sets as you kind of move into peak week is kind of the way I've sort of looked at it. Because if you're doing multiple shows and you're going to have multiple peak weeks, generally during those peak weeks, right, you're not going to be pushing excessively heavy weights. It's going to be higher rep ranges, moderate intensities, even lower, basically not taking the muscles anywhere near failure, just getting the blood flowing around the body. So if you're entering into a phase where you have multiple shows coming up, it might make more sense just to structure that training that way anyway.
Yeah, I agree. The peak week training, I've been there and done that, made the error of, I remember I actually went too far. This was based off some advice and some literature that showed that blood flow restriction training doesn't lead to muscle damage, and so not to get your muscles sore. And so I did some blood flow restriction training in a peak week, and it got me horrendously sore. And that's exactly what you want to avoid, which is why, like you said, you back off, because if the muscle's sore, it can't uptake glycogen, and then you also can't pose very well. So that really fucked with me. And yeah, in your peak weeks, don't do anything extreme basically with training. They should almost be like a bit of a deload style, like week of training. So stress is the biggest thing you're just trying to reduce. And yeah, if you're maintaining heavy loads, actually, I just had a client check in with me this morning. I was like, my lower back's a little bit sore. He competed just the weekend prior. He's got a show in just under a couple of weeks. I was like, hey, don't worry about your RDLs. Let's just do some lying leg curls. Let's stimulate the muscle and let's not cause any injuries, because that's the last thing you want at the end of prep. And that's the issue people can get into, where they're losing strength, but they're trying to fight it, and they do let their technique slide, whether or not they cut ROM or they bounce more, and that can cause and lead to injury, which is not great. It's like chasing the logbook, but in a different way.
Yeah, it's like seeing Nick Walker when he tore his hamstring right before the Olympia, and you think, for a guy, his whole life is banking on this and his whole livelihood, everything. It's quite a devastating point to find yourself in. So that's obviously another consideration is injury too. Now, in your most recent prep, I was amazed to see, I guess, 4 years down the track, you're only up about 4 pounds, but the shape, size, symmetry, it's all looking a hell of a lot bigger. Plenty more lines, your conditioning and symmetry. I think you were talking about your lats and how you have quite a blocky waist, and how some of the exercises you've been working on and the way you've been structuring your training, it's really helped you with developing that X shape or that V taper. What kind of things would you put that down to, and how you've been able to change your your proportions to achieve a physique that you're, much more proud of this time around.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm glad that people seem to be thinking that I look very different this time around than last time. And it's always a good sign when people are saying that. I do think one thing that I've changed is my posing is a little bit better, especially on my front relaxed. This is a shot that, as you all know, is basically probably I would say it's the most important. It's the first opportunity you get to give an impression. It's the pose that you're in the longest. It is basically your symmetry shot. And people get confused by symmetry because they think it's just like, oh, it just means symmetrical, like upper body is developed as lower body, left to right symmetrical. But probably the biggest part of symmetry that a judge is looking at least as far as I'm concerned from judging, is the X frame. When I like squint at them, do they have a really nice X frame? That's kind of what a lot of judges are looking for. And so if you have a blocky waist, you want to make it look as small as possible. One, with posing, shove your hips back. And so I'm now doing that. I did that in previous preps, but last prep, I had some posing coaching and was advised not to do that for some reason. It's just their preference. Different posing coaches have different preferences. Whereas now, make sure to shove those back, bring my chest nice and high forward to make that more pronounced. And so, yeah, I've made some kind of posing changes to make that X frame look a bit better. But then, yeah, to make the lats come out more, definitely been one of the things I've changed for the last over 2 years now. Obviously, there's a lot of literature coming out talked about from Milo Wolf, not necessarily him always conducting it, but it really came about because he did a meta-analysis on range of motion. And there was a little bit of a segment on, hey, when we look at partial range of motion, yeah, short length partials where we're doing that contracted position, that doesn't beat out full range of motion. But when you're doing long length partials, which there was very limited evidence on, that actually seems to do really well. And there's lots of evidence out now on the calves, and there's building evidence on other muscle groups like the chest, the quads, the triceps, the biceps, where making sure there's tension in that stretched position is a really important thing. That combined with knowing that we get more growth when we take a muscle closer to failure for the back was a like light bulb moment. It's like, hey, every back exercise pretty much is hardest when we're contracted in that short position, and we're weakest there and we're getting least growth. So if I'm calling technical failure when I can't touch the lat pull down to my chest, I am leaving potentially 5 to 10 reps maybe that I could have got at partials at that longer muscle length. Exactly. So I've been doing like length and partials for my back for over 2 years, just length and partials. So it felt so foreign and weird at first because I was like team full ROM, love RP, love the team full ROM, love the emphasis on that. I think that was a really, really good thing. But for muscles where they're trained and the short position is the hardest, it might make sense to do some long muscle length partials, however you implement that. So I just decided, hey, I'm going to leave the short position and just go long length. And so that's been a big focus of mine. And then that combined with Coach Kassem and N1 and being open-minded to using some of his exercises as tools, I was a little bit close-minded to some of that stuff at first because some of the content was a bit jarring to me at one stage where it was like, hey, there's a red cross next to lat pull down, throw away the bar pull down. I can't say it's necessarily Kassem that promoted that message, but people in the biomechanics field were kind of promoting that, like you should only do neutral grip pull downs for lats or what have you. And I was like, eh. But I have been implementing some of his iliac pull downs, pull arounds, doing more single arm work for my lats to get a bit more of a stretch around the rib cage. That's been beneficial. And just thinking more about the lats versus upper back versus just horizontal rowing and vertical pulling. That's been a bit of a quote unquote game changer for me. And that's allowed me to get more out of my back training for sure. Probably the long length partials were the biggest thing, but alongside a little bit more thought about my execution and exercise selection has allowed them to, grow, I think.
So you're probably a mix of both, but you haven't taken sets to failure in the shortened position for, say, rows or pull downs, and then gone to overload in the lengthened position. So you're saying you do full sets in the lengthened range of motion without those partials in the shortened range.
Exactly. Yeah. Just pull down to 90 degrees. The reason I started that way was because Milo was basically saying, hey, this is what the literature looks at. It looks at doing 50% basically of the range of motion. So if you're implementing it in a different way, you're not really lining up with what the research has shown to why length and partials seem to be superior. Now we have evidence, I think it was on the calves, where they did basically full ROM into partials and they saw better growth that way too. So I definitely think that's an approach. The question is, do we get a better stimulus to fatigue trade-off from just skipping the short position altogether, not getting the fatigue that would provide, and just sticking to the most hypertrophic range of motion and getting more length and partial exposures? It's a question we don't have the answer for it. And I think both the differences are going to be minimal. But yeah, I'd look at my back training now if I saw myself in the gym and be like, say 3 or 4 years ago, I'd be like, that guy is just like ego lifting, like, come on. Whereas now, like, I actually is again that better understanding of, hey, in some situations, momentum to help you get through that sticking point of short where you're weak could be a beneficial thing. But now I just obscure that short position altogether.
So if you had a training partner, say that, I imagine a lot of your training is individual. You train solo. It seems that way from a lot of your video footage. Do you feel as though if you did have, say, a training partner that could help you push through that shortened range of motion might be a better way to overload? Or is this kind of one of the other reasons why you've decided to go that approach with optimizing the amount of stimulus you're getting in that extended lengthened range?
Yeah, I think at this stage, I can't be super confident, but I think that would just be, I think you'd be better off just doing more partials than having someone spot you to help through that sticking point and get you short. I think the stimulus fatigue trade-off of just getting more length and partials is going to be out getting that extra range in that short position with someone helping you through that sticking point. That's where I'm at with it at the moment, at least.
And so in your prep, I think one of the things that you've talked about has been how your new coach that you're working with has made such quick and frequent adjustments in your diet. How have you found that now? I guess you've got 2 refeed days, but having such quick scheduled changes in your diet, and how's it been working with a new coach?
Yeah, so Cliff Wilson is my coach if people don't know who he is. And it's been great working with a coach, first of all, to just say that all the benefits I see my clients saying about, like, sometimes I'm shocked how, like, oh yeah, it's so beneficial. I don't feel like I'm doing that much, for example. They're like, man, it's such a load off my mind. I love being coached. Thank you so much. I'm like almost to the point where I'm like, oh, this is a bit embarrassing how much you're like giving me props here. Like I'm just doing my job, dude. Now I'm like, oh, it's so nice just having someone to report to, a load of stress off my mind. I don't have to think about what I need to do apart from doing what he tells me to do. So yeah, it's been great having a coach. I think some people are very coachable and they're probably the ones who really like being coached. And I would say I'm a very coachable person. I really like if someone wants to tell me what to do and I trust them, I love it. I'll go and I'll be that workhorse for you. Sometimes I struggle even with leading. It's just not something that comes intuitively to me. And I just know myself like that as a person. So it's great to have that person in my corner that I know and trust to be able to make those decisions. There are some things that are imperfect about it, but I just think that's online coaching, like communication speed and stuff sometimes is just a challenge with online coaching for some people. But it honestly has been working super well so far. And I'm really grateful to have Cliff in my corner to make those decisions. And then in terms of the frequent decisions, actually interesting. So that was the frequent decisions are something that Cliff definitely says he makes and is a kind of thing that he likes to do. And we definitely had some frequent changes at the start of my time with him. But as we've got deeper, I would say the frequency really dropped. There was about 6 weeks or something in prep where nothing changed. My nutrition was just the same week in, week out. And there were even multiple weeks where I thought he was going to make an adjustment. So I was almost like, I check in with him on a Monday, but I'm like 10 hours or something ahead of him. So I was already trying to predict my Monday macros and try and hit what I think he would change it to. And then I'd get my email on the Tuesday being like, no changes this week. I'll be like, I made those adjustments for no reason. Yeah. So then I learned just to keep the Monday the same. So yeah, it has actually been all right. If a coach does a good job of explaining why they have a certain check-in process and why they have a certain methodology, and you understand that to be totally fine and workable, given your knowledge base and what you know and like about things, I think it's totally fine. So yeah, it's been totally fine doing it that way and following his adjustments. But like I said, they were quite frequent at the start and then they've dropped off. And I no longer have 2 refeed days, sadly. That was an adjustment last week. He stripped away one of my refeed days and stripped away a good 300-400 calories. So in a bit of a dig at the moment as I'm coming towards 4 weeks out.
I guess one of the things that I've sort of took an interest in was how Cliff prescribes ranges with your different macronutrient splits, but also how high your protein intake was. Is there any reasoning behind why he's found to have such high protein intakes have been beneficial with his clients? And what have you previously used in the past? And have you found that your body's responded quite well to these changes?
So in the past, I used just normally about 1 gram per pound or a little bit above when I'm dieting to see if that would have any potential mitigation of muscle protein breakdown. And now, Cliff is substantially above that. And in fact, sometimes like for this last week, he made an adjustment and kept my protein where it was. And I was like, if I was coaching someone, I'd definitely be bringing down that protein because I'd be trying to save onto those carbohydrates, thinking they're going to help bolster to performance a little bit more, but he's also kept my protein and fats higher than I would have them at this stage. I'd have my fats down at like 40 grams. He's got me at like 60. And then my protein at the moment on my low days is at 235 grams. Bear in mind, I'm just under 180 pounds. So it's far above 1 gram per pound. And initially it was kind of weird. I enjoyed the high fat actually, because it made me eat more healthy fats that I actually generally really enjoy. And I at least psychologically feel good from it. So more nuts, nut butters, avocado, that sort of thing. That was quite fun. And I have enjoyed having higher fat throughout prep. So that has been a bit of a lesson for me to kind of keep that a bit higher maybe than I would have previously. Then with protein, yeah, that took a bit of time to get used to. And I do and have enjoyed having higher protein. I can't say whether or not it's really made much of a difference. In theory, I can't think to as why it's made like it's particularly more beneficial. Even data on the thermic effect of feeding. I mean, it's very minimal, the amount of extra calorie burn you get from digesting protein versus like a carbohydrate. And then the data on like satiety, it seems to be more of an acute short-term response you get from having higher protein. Once you're high and you've sustained that, it doesn't seem to make much difference that it's more satiating, which kind of makes sense to me because a lot of carbohydrates are like very high volume, higher fiber, slow digesting versus proteins. So I think often, yeah, I don't think the satiety benefit necessarily even holds. So yeah, I can't really think to as why, but I trust Cliff in his experience with the number of people he's taken to stage and the consistent results that he seems to be getting with people and getting them very lean, skinless, he would call it. And that's kind of the goal for me. His rationale for it is mostly from what I gather, and he'd probably be able to speak about it in a bit more depth. And I probably had him on to talk about it a bit on my podcast at some point, but it is mostly he's just seen really good results this way. And so that kind of leads him to make that decision. It's similar to, he just takes Monday weigh-ins, which is different to how I do things. I would take more daily weigh-ins, take a weekly average, smooth out things because there's fluctuations. But he takes Monday weigh-ins or one single weigh-in across the week because that has allowed him to have better results with clients. He makes more aggressive cuts that way apparently, and that gets his clients more often in shape. So I think he's just found his process that works. And again, I trust in him and his experience and knowledge, and that there's no downside really, apart from I have less carbs, which you could say, hey, you're wasting protein, but you could put towards carbs that could maintain performance a bit better. But my performance has been fine. So I've not really seen any downsides to the higher protein at the moment.
But you get your conversion of protein to glucose anyway, I guess, if you're having excessive protein for your requirements. So there's that, I guess, there's probably different things happening within your body that one of the things with protein intake too, as you say, it's very satiating. And I'm very similar in the sense that for me, eating, chicken breast, fish, whey protein, these kind of foods seem to make me feel fuller. If it's, say, putting away basmati rice or these kind of sources of carbohydrate tend to, for me, become, and I know oats is one of those ones that you've rated really highly on your chart in terms of, we'll go through that in a moment, but oats have been right at the top for you. And you said it is one of those contentious topics, but for me, I find towards the back end of a prep, protein oats for me is very highly palatable. It's very easy for me to consume a lot of protein oats because I like the taste of it. It makes me want more. So I tend to find that I just opt for starchy vegetables like pumpkin or sweet potato because these vegetables, they fill me up, plenty of fiber, but they're not necessarily that exciting to eat. So it doesn't, I don't think too much of it. I just eat what quantity of food I've been prescribed or how much I'm eating on my current diet. And I don't really think too much more of it. But if I'm having something that's very highly palatable or that I really have a keen interest in eating more of, I tend to remove that from the diet. So proteins, high fiber, plant-based foods always get the green lights, which is something which you have, as you get more food focused into a prep, you've done a bit of a review on the different foods and how you would rank them in the context of a prep. And as we said, you've put oats right at the top of the list and a whole host of different vegetables. And when you were thinking about doing this video, you were in prep, weren't you? And you were very food focused. You were thinking about, you're getting all obsessive and very highly invested in all these different foods that you can have during prep, which are very voluminous and, don't blow the calorie budget that you can eat a lot of, and the texture of the carrots and the cucumber. I imagine that was something you were going through, experiencing at that point when you started the video, but I think nonetheless very helpful for a lot of the listeners, which is why I want to unpack it.
Yeah, for sure. I recorded that. So I released these videos maybe 2 to 4 weeks after they've been on the members site that we have. So they come out for the members a little bit early and then they come out here late. So it was during prep. But yeah, I'd seen these like ranking videos and I was just like, I must have been in that moment of, I wanted to do something different, first of all, from like everyone was ranking exercises or whatever. And I was like, hey, I haven't seen anyone ranking food. Let's do food. And yeah, definitely with the amount of thought going through my head, you can see that I'm food focused in that sense. And I'm thinking about these things on quite a high level, more than your average person would be thinking about it. And I am so surprised at how well it went down. I was like, this is going to be, no one's going to really pay much attention to this. It was a super easy video to do. I just sat down, like thought about a bunch of foods, dropped them into this like template and then just started moving them around and talking through them. But yeah, people seem to really enjoy it, which is funny. And it's funny also, you mentioned you tend to remove things that you find palatable as you get deeper into it, which makes complete sense. Like they're more palatable. You maybe get a bigger dopamine response, you crave them more. And so there is this balance. And I think it is a bit individual person to person because, yeah, my oats at the moment, I literally have some oats here that I haven't been able to eat yet this morning because we're nice and early. So they're getting delayed a little bit. And I have that oatmeal, the protein oatmeal twice in my day. And then the other two meals like veggies and like a lean protein and salad basically are the other two meals. And for whatever reason, even if a certain food sometimes makes me a bit hungrier, I will hold on to it because I actually enjoy it that much. So long as it doesn't lead to me not adhering to my diet, I'm happy doing that. So even to the point of often on my refeed days, a lot of people just like eat more of the food they've already been having, whereas I will introduce some more like palatable foods because I'm like, this tastes so damn good to me right now. And what's novel for me is when I mass, my appetite goes completely the other way. I don't enjoy food at all. So I hold on to this like high enjoyment of food and just the ability to like taste every flavor that like a carrot gives me and the texture it gives me. So I'm a bit of a unique case in that sense, which is a bit funny. But yeah, you mentioned a lot of good points there. And I don't know if you had any specific questions. I just wanted to say that.
I think it's funny because like I've spoken to a lot of people over the years and when they get into a prep and how food focused they get, whether it be people start writing lists in their phone of all the foods that they want to taste after prep or all these like, you can tell it's probably not the best relationship to have with food. And as we spoke about with Jack Radford Smith, there is a lot of eating disorders that come out of bodybuilding. But I guess to help those that are kind of stuck in that food focus during prep or have a poor relationship with food, I want to go through some of those kind of S tier, A tier foods and why they're such great options during a dieting phase. Because if someone's listening to this podcast and they are competing, then that's great. But I imagine there will be a lot of people who are listening that just general gym goers that want to get in better shape for summer. And what are some simple changes or food selections or choices they can make that will help them to get leaner, but still have more food within their diet? Now, the first tier you had, S tier, one of the ones that I've been utilizing a lot at the moment, or a couple of them. Mushrooms, cucumber was one that you mentioned, carrots, berries, potatoes, as we said, oats. One of them that you didn't mention was pumpkin as well, which again, I've talked about numerous times in the last couple of podcasts with me getting more and more food focused, just kind of playing around with different macronutrient profiles of these different fibrous vegetables. Why do they make such good options when you're in a calorie deficit? And what kind of strategies have you utilized to bulk out your meals utilizing these plant-based foods? I know that one example you talked about was the oats and the zucchini, I think. And there was another one where you were talking about whey protein, where you'd make like a chocolate mud cake with some baking soda. So what other examples have you kind of utilized?
Yeah, so I will say that video definitely was, I don't know if I said it, but hopefully it wasn't meant to be fully comprehensive because, there's too many foods in the world to be able to do it. Yeah. But I think pumpkin can be a great one. In the UK, it's just not super popular. We have it like tinned, but to buy it in like a supermarket is more rare. But it's very similar to squash, like butternut squash, those sort of vegetables. But I always find, for me, I don't know how they come for you, but if they're coming as a vegetable, they're a pain in the ass to prepare because you have to like peel off the skin and all this malarkey that I'm not super fond of. And that's something that I actually, just to mention this at the start, because they're things that I've avoided so far. So I haven't tried to bulk out my oats. I haven't tried to like make these mug cakes. Those very like, you get them all over Instagram, these like diet friendly hack recipe type things like protein fluff. I don't know if I mentioned that one, but that's something I did in my first prep and I never did again because I was like, causes too much gastric distress. So I mentioned that a few times with like fiber going too high can just cause your stomach to be all bloated and uncomfortable. Digestion's not as good and that can mess up your look, but also even the process on the scale and your training and just feeling uncomfortable and distended. Protein fluff, yeah, I don't know if you've had that one, Hayden, but have
Yeah,
you had
so
it?
we were talking about with Jack Radford Smith, and he was saying how he just is very consistent, monotonous with his eating. And his first prep, he did try to bulk out his meals a hell of a lot with pumpkin, excessive amounts of fiber. This time around, very much just rice, lean protein, small servings of fresh fruit or vegetables, very consistent. But he said in his first prep, um, he made the mistake of trying to bulk out his meals way too much. Now, in
Sure.
the past, I've done very much the same thing. And, there's like this custard powder you can use that's at Woolworths here in Australia. And it's very light, so low calorie. And you can mix it with, say, whey protein. And it kind of similar concept to what you're saying there. It fluffs it up or it
Yeah.
expands the protein to a big bowl, essentially, of whey protein, which is obviously more filling. But I think you can get too carried away with all those little tricks and hacks, as you say.
Exactly that. So yeah, just it's loads of air that you're essentially eating at that point, and it just can really bloat you, feel very uncomfortable. And it's the same with my oats. In the past preps, I would cook them and cook them and cook them to try and add water to make them as voluminous as possible. Whereas now I literally have like I just cover them. I don't even like people, what's the ratio of water to oats and like how many grams of water are you having to grams of oats or whatever. I don't know. I just fill it up in the bowl, chuck in the microwave, stir it once, chuck it in again, stir it once, put in my protein powder, done. And in fact, I like it thick versus like voluminous because I like it that way. So I'm very much like Jack. I think a lot of competitors learn that where they like try and really hack hunger, use all these diet tools, whether or not it be like calorie-free syrups and all of this general thoughts and things like this, like high fiber foods. And then you just become more comfortable with the hunger and you just accept it, which is why I'm like, actually, I'm happy having this palatable oats because I enjoy it more and I'm fine with the hunger. Like I'm going to be hungry no matter what, pretty much. You kind of have to accept it. I don't know if that's a good recommendation for a first time dieter necessarily. You almost have to make the mistake of having too much high volume food and going down that route of high fiber and all the fruits and vegetables to then learn, hey, I need to back off that. And there's this like nice middle ground where I can feel good and fine, because if you do go down like palatable and less of that, that can lead to you not adhering. So whatever's going to drive quality adherence is probably the most important thing there. And in terms of the reasons those foods were selected as S tier, I think versatility is one. So like oats are pretty versatile in terms of what you can do with them, and they're very easy, portable, like you can make them in many different places. And I have a clear bias towards oats.
Yeah.
Obviously they have good amount of fiber, they do volumize as well, and so that's a great thing. Then the other ones in terms of those vegetables are selected pretty good volume, so low calorie per bite foods.
And low
I think
fiber. I think
yes.
the ones you mentioned, like cucumber, mushroom, and that's what I've been kind of getting at. Some people probably think that the food focus with me at the moment, a lot of my discussions have been around this topic. But for me, the mushrooms, the cucumber, these kind of foods, which are lower in fiber, a lot more voluminous in terms of how much food you can eat, have served as a much better option than, say, eating a hell of a lot of pumpkin or sweet potato or these vegetables, which tend to have a lot more fiber in them too.
It's really easy for the fiber to get out of control if you're not kind of cognizant of it at all. And that's where, yeah, once you've been dieting this long and in a prep situation, you're a bit more aware of that. And mushrooms and cucumber are virtually all water anyway.
Sure.
You have to be, I think I said this with mushrooms, you have to be careful not to cook them too
Not to
much because
cook
then
them
you
too much.
lose all the volume in them and then they just become like little shriveled things. It's kind of like spinach. Like spinach could be a great diet food, but then if you cook it down, it could be 200 grams and it's like in a teaspoon or a tablespoon, something like that, right? So yeah, that's why those are particularly great. But I actually had to remove cauliflower and broccoli recently, and I wasn't even having huge amounts, but they were just causing my stomach to be bloated and distended. And so I just subbed in again. Carrots seem to be, in terms of FODMAP as well, carrots are a bit more friendly on like FODMAP foods, which are foods that generally can irritate the gut. And you're a bit just more sensitive when you're in prep to everything. Your immune system is downregulated, your digestion is a little slow and sluggish because it's trying to get every nutrient out of the food. So that you just have to be careful of those. And then white potato, I think I said, was one of them that's up there. And it's a very similar starch to pumpkin and to squash. In fact, pumpkin and squash are lower calorie per bite, but very similar in terms of macros to white potato. White potato, I think, maybe has a little bit less fiber because they're higher calorie probably. The mistake people make with that one is they think, oh, white potato is super like satiating and it's a great diet food. And then they have, I don't know, the extreme example would be they have chips. But even if you do like oven baked, like low calorie fries, or you do them in the air fryer, you have made them more palatable. You've changed the texture of them. You made them more crunchy. You maybe reduced the volume of them. So when you're thinking about peak satiety of a white potato, it's like boiled white potato. So that's what makes that food a really good choice and why that would be S tier. But yeah, like you said, generally the foods selected there are low calorie per bite, high volume, without the crazy amount of fiber included in them. So they just make a great kind of way to fill your stomach up without causing problems.
And so some of those that aren't so good, I think you had bagels, white rice, protein bars, one of those ones which Eric Helms talked about when he did his first preps. He was kind of following that if it fits your macros approach, and he included protein bars and that kind. But again, very, very satiating food, especially the ones now. If you get the BSC bars here in Australia or the Muscle Nation, I'm not sure if you get them over there in the UK, but they're like crack cocaine. They're so sweet. Obviously have a lot of fiber in them too, a lot of the time as well. But they're so sweet. They're like delicious. So, you start to eat those, you start to want more and more. It's never enough. So
yeah, definitely. It's protein bars are one of those ones where people are like, oh yeah, I'm being healthy. Let's go for a protein bar. And yeah, it's probably a better choice than having just a chocolate bar because at least you get like 20 grams of 15, 20 grams of protein. But one of the downsides to them, especially again, when you're dieting, it's really weird. This again is very unique to being quite dieted down in a contest prep. But like people have calorie ranges, protein ranges, fat, carbs, I almost have like a fiber range that I want to land within. And it becomes a limit at some stage because I'm like, I want to maximize satiety, so high fiber, but if I go too high, it's going to cause me problems. I'm going to feel uncomfortable. My digestion's not going to be as good. So I have like an upper limit. It's same with caffeine. I have like a range of caffeine or a caffeine cap. I know if I go over about 250 to 300 milligrams of caffeine past like 12 p.m., my sleep is going to be bad. So I cap it earlier. So I'm very careful about kind of, I don't know, picking and choosing what makes up that caffeine, or similar with fiber, picking and choosing things that make up that. And some of these protein bars, like 20 grams of fiber, and suddenly what is meant to be very satiating and filling because it's fiber, but now it's taken away from all the fiber I could have had from more high volume foods later in the day. Also, a lot of these protein bars are packed with like sugar alcohols, which again, in high quantities can cause people upset stomach and things like this. So along with being super palatable, like you said, many of them, we have grenade carb killers is one of the big ones in the UK, and they're just super tasty. They are almost just as nice as like a chocolate bar in many ways. So they don't serve the purpose of being satiating with a diet like you would like. And then, like you said, some of these refined carbohydrates, like just basmati rice, you already mentioned it, or like white bread, just the white bagels, that sort of thing, without any of the whole grains. You remove all of the fiber. And it sounds like I'm sick, like it's contradictory, but you don't want zero fiber. You just want to make sure you're not having excessive amounts. And so I would opt for a white potato over just having a bagel. But on my refeed day, I might include not just having way more potato and way more oats. I might include maybe some refined carbohydrates so that my fiber doesn't get out of control. But I've already got the baseline of satiety from my typical diet, so I don't need tons more of that because then I'll just get bloated and distended. I can include maybe some basmati rice or some bagels and that sort of thing. So I always say, whatever you use during a mass phase to help your appetite, flip it on its head for a cut almost. Like you want the opposites here. So what would be S tier for a bulk is like D tier during a cut, and what's D tier during a cut is probably S tier during a bulk, and vice versa. So yeah, protein bars are good when you're bulking probably.
So you got plenty of funny prep stories. Like I think when you get into this food focused phase, as I was saying, like I have this really high affinity for understanding the nutritional information of all sorts of different vegetables and protein sources. And I think it's obviously a very beneficial learning experience to some extent. But yeah, I think it's funny how you get carried away. One of the stories I had recently, my supplement sponsor, VPA Australia, they obviously send out whey protein, whey isolate, so premium WPC, WPI, all these products. And I think when they released the iced coffee flavor, I didn't actually realize when I tipped the bag of whey into
I know what you're going to say.
Tupperware, when I actually tipped the bag of whey into my Tupperware and discarded the bag, I was, for about a week there when I was having this whey, I was like, why am I not able to sleep? And it was because of the caffeine content in the whey protein. I was so used to having like my post-training shake in the afternoon, say, or it was after midday. But I was saying, why can't I get to sleep? And then I realized, wait, I've been using the wrong way. Anyway, it was a bit of a blonde moment on my part. But in prep, have you got any stories where, like, I guess your sleep's already compromised when you're in a massive deficit and you're fatigued? What kind of stories have you got? Surely there's some funny ones out there you can remember.
Oh, so on that note, I knew you were going to say about the caffeine because that's the sort of thing because I love coffee flavored things, but it always catches you out because they're not using
Yeah.
decaf, are they? So there's caffeine in there. And I remember I had a client who he never really had diet drinks. Then he started dieting and he was like, oh, I've been having some Pepsi, 2 liters,
Yeah.
Pepsi Max a day. And I'm like, do you want to work out the caffeine in that? Because you're also having coffee. And his caffeine content was so high. So people, yeah, that and also dark chocolate. A lot of people have a lot of like high cocoa percentage dark chocolate, like maybe a bar a day. And they're getting a lot of caffeine through that they don't realize. Or even cocoa powder, because cocoa powder is great to bulk out things. It's like it adds a bit of a dark chocolate flavor. But again, caffeine adds up. And if you have that late in the day, it can catch you. So I totally relate to you there. And that's something I'm aware of. But I would say my first prep probably had most of the worst kind of stories. I'm trying to think what would be one. I don't know if this is like an odd thing, but I think 2 times I went out to eat, I took a weighing scale with me. So I'd be in a restaurant and I'd weigh out the food that they gave me. And yeah, I did that at Nando's and then I did that at like another restaurant. And I would never do that now. It's just a level of perfection that's not required. I even, during that prep, this is probably the worst thing. I bought one of those really small, like digital scales that weighs out like little bits of powder or whatever. I don't know, people that sell drugs, I think probably buy these. And I bought one of those because I was like, oh, that'd be amazing. I can keep it in my pocket. So then whenever I go out with my girlfriend, like I can bring this with me. And so I remember going and getting some like frozen yogurt and I was weighing all of this stuff out on this bloody scale and looking probably like the biggest weirdo and just be like, that's not healthy. You don't need this degree of precision, Steve. Like that is not a cool thing to be doing. So yeah, probably my girlfriend would have better stories. I also remember because we started dating my first prep. So this was all like full on because I was ignorant to what prep would bring. So was she. We were just dating. We're still together, thankfully. She hasn't left me yet. So
It's probably a good
I
precursor for a relationship if you can stick through.
yeah,
What
true.
you're at.
Very true. She did say there was a point at which she was like considering going because she was moving house or moving flat and I just didn't even offer to help. And I was so ignorant to like the fact she wanted my help. But regardless, one of the things I did is I would make us like protein pancakes and I'd smother it with this Walden Farms chocolate sauce and stuff. And I was like big on like, these are amazing. You're going to enjoy this so much. And she told me afterwards that she completely faked that it was nice. She was like, those were horrible. That chocolate sauce is disgusting. And I was like, I'm so glad you didn't tell me at the time because it really would have hurt me to my soul because of how much I enjoyed it and how much I thought you enjoyed it. Yeah, I don't know if I've got any other kind of crazy or funny stories apart from those. But sleep, as you mentioned it, that's been something that's a complete game changer from my first prep to now. I was so ignorant of the importance of sleep, how to get good sleep. Whereas even this prep, now coming to 4 weeks out from my show, my sleep's still pretty damn good. And I think that's in large part down to understanding the role of caffeine, having a good sleep routine and behaviors going into it.
I was listening to the episode you did with Brian DeCosta, and he reiterated some of the sentiments that I'd say I experience a fair bit, which is where I have a good bedtime routine. It'll be really weird. Like for the most part of the week, I'll get really good quality sleep, and then there'll be like one night here and there where it's just I'm up going to the bathroom a lot because obviously I don't have the same amount of glycogen, so I'm always going to the toilet. There's so many different, I guess, things that you experience through prep that many people I'm sure don't know about. I'm getting to that point now where the weight training is fine, but the steps, or like when you're doing your cardio, there's this level of lethargy. What other things would you kind of raise that people might not be aware of if they haven't undertaken a bodybuilding prep that you might experience physiologically?
I've got three that immediately come to mind. One is, actually, one, I don't know if it's a funny story, but the peeing in the night. In my 2017 prep, I really remember waking up like 6 times a night consistently, getting up to pee. It was a nightmare. Whereas now,
Thought
I'm
you
good.
had diabetes.
Man, it was just ridiculous. But I didn't even, again, that's one of the things where I will cut fluids 2 hours before bed and I'll taper them throughout the evening. So then that helps. Whereas I just wouldn't even think about it back then. It seems really logical, but I wasn't doing it. Whereas now a really good night is 1 pee a night. Often it's 2. Normally that second one is just before I want to wake up as well, which is annoying. And at worst 3, but that happens very rarely for me right now, which is good. Then, so the peeing in the night, definitely agree with you with that. One of the ones people might not think about, but little things that typically wouldn't irritate you at all.
Yep.
At other times, other diets will irritate you. So 2 examples for me are when I'm walking my dog. I hate it because I love her, but right now she just irritates the shit out of me, like sniffing everything, trying to eat everything, and I'm just not here for it. So I struggle with the irritability she provides me. Like she would run into my office and jump at me during a podcast quite often. And normally I'm just like, hey, it's fine, calm down. Whereas now I'm like, oh my God, that's so triggering. And then the other thing is my girlfriend eating. Typically, like I would be completely fine with it. She's making a bit of noise, she's sucking her fingers. Whereas now I'm like, I hear everything. I'm just like, oh my God, if you suck that next finger, I am going to like flip. And I have to keep it to myself because I'm like, it's not reasonable. But sometimes I struggle not to make a comment. Yeah. So that irritability hurts. And then the other one, I think for some people, it's like they'll know this, but the libido loss, like it just creeps up on me. Like I just suddenly am like, oh, for a week I haven't thought about anything sexual at all. Like my feed has now changed from sometimes those thoughts.
Women
like,
to food.
Women will creep up on my feed, whereas now it's like it's all recipes. I'm like, fuck. Like God damn it, why is this happening? I don't like either particularly. I just want it like fitness and educational content if I can. But you know, the algorithm catches me sometimes.
It always seems
at weak
to,
moments.
like when you're in prep, whenever you're on the treadmill or the stair mill at the gym, the TV shows that come on are always cooking shows, and I've never noticed it until I'm in prep. Like
that's something I've changed. I used to, because my girlfriend likes cooking and she likes those sort of shows, so we would indulge in them together and really a lot in prep. Whereas now I try and avoid them. I'm just like, it feels good, but it's just, I know it's driving my food focus up, and let's try and avoid them.
I guess that what you touched on there about the weighing your food at Nando's, and I guess to some extent disordered eating, the importance of the social element of a prep. I think you learn as you get more experienced when to pull the pin on a lot of those social outings and when to really lock in with your nutrition. Now, I understand during your prep you're doing at the moment pizza, so Domino's pizza and McDonald's, which I think are the 2 that you seem to love on the weekends because you can really accurately track these meals. You also have a high affinity, obviously. You like the taste. You said you dropped one out of your prep as of late. Would it be, one or the other? Do you have a preference? But also in terms of actually tracking these meals, but actually going out and being able to enjoy some time with the people that you love and that are important to you, how beneficial have you found that in the context of your psychological health and well-being during this prep?
Yeah. So I think it's nice to just have a sense of normality within the week, within the months. And that is for me and my girlfriend, and she's the person I'm being most social with. It is, we like to eat out and we like to have like food made for us. So like having a takeaway, and that's something we do. My entire off season is every Friday we get a takeaway. It's just like standard. We go out to eat on the weekend because that's what we like to do. So part of that is I like it, and it keeps me feeling like bodybuilding is just my lifestyle and it's complementing that. It's not taking away. And it also, again, it feels like it's not taking away as much from her because she enjoys those things too. And if I'm not doing it, she's not going to be able to do that. And so it keeps our relationship in a good place. And then, so I get that kind of like sense of feeling like a normal person, and that it's just part of my day to day, and it's not nothing special or different. And then it also keeps our relationship better, and we get that opportunity to be together and enjoy it and what have you. And of course, there's workarounds, and I probably will go there and we have a little bit gone there with making meals together instead, because that's just easier for us, for me rather, to adhere to the diet and things. And that degree of accuracy becomes more important as I get closer and closer to stage. It's funny you asked this because today is my refeed day. And so this is the Friday. It's typically the day I would have a takeaway. And yeah, the variability in that takeaway is reduced as time has gone on because, like you said, the McDonald's, it's very standardized. It always comes pretty much the same. The biggest variance would be the chips in terms of like how full is the like bucket of chips that they give us or whatever. And like I just give my girlfriend the heavier one. I kind of feel them like, yeah, you have the heavier one. It's tempting to take the heavier one, I'll be honest, but I don't. So that's happened. And I've just reduced what I have. Like I get this meal deal basically. I've removed the chocolate shake. Hey, I'm not having the chocolate shake. I just can't afford that 400 calories anymore. Let's kind of drop that down. And then the Domino's again is something we would have like every week during our off season. Not every week, like every other week. We kind of rotate between the two. So at this point, I'm not ruling one out or the other. But today is typically it would be a Domino's day, and I might continue. I may have it, I may not. I haven't fully decided yet. But if I do, I'll probably change to their thin crust now to make things a little bit reduced.
Keep them all the way through the stage. At what point will he completely remove the
refeeds or
I guess
refeeds? So
going out and eating Domino's pizza, I guess.
Yeah, so he hasn't asked. Kind of, I have said it. I said it a while ago that that's what I do on my refeed days, and I don't know if I asked like when do I need to remove it, but I think he would dig into what I'm doing deeper on those days if he thought there was something going on that wasn't seeing results. And for me, I'm not ignorant to the fact that that could implicate results, but I don't want to remove them unless I need to. So there's something that I'm happy to keep like as long as I can still see good results, because many will look at them and they're just what would be the pros of keeping them in? It's all negatives. It's all inaccuracies. You could just have like a home cooked meal, but there are pros, as I mentioned. They're very de-stressing for me. I really enjoy them. They're good for my relationship. Yeah, and again, if it comes back to like, if it fits your macros, like they fit my macros, I'm pretty damn sure they're within like a proximal amount of calories. And I'm happy paying that slight accuracy cost for all the benefits they provide on the other side. But not for a first timer, probably not great. Like the more experienced you are at tracking and doing these things, the better you'll be able to do it. But I think even for a lot of preppers, it'll be too stressful. They'll be like, I want the control.
One of the challenges you have had recently, and it'll be interesting to hear your insights where you're at now, 4 weeks out, where you're at that pointy end of prep, probably getting towards within a couple of kilos or so of what your stage weight will likely be. Injury. So your low back injury you sustained when deadlifting. One of the things I want to talk to you about, because we did speak to Martin Ruffalo about some of the research around pain medications. I wanted to talk to you about, and I know that you have some physios that work with you at Revive Stronger, Mike Chalice physio. And so I guess drawing on some of the insights and things he's taught you about injury management with pain. Now, I imagine there's a lot of people listening that are working around different niggles or injuries. I wanted to sort of delve into a little bit about your experience with back pain and also some of the philosophies and strategies that you've utilized to help manage that pain throughout this prep.
For sure. So yeah, man, this is great because I haven't felt that pain in, I don't know, it feels like months. It maybe hasn't been that long. I don't know when that came out now, but it's so great because at the time it was really severe and I'd noticed it kind of building up over time as maybe I was working with a range of motion that was slightly in excess of what my lower back could manage on the straight leg deadlift, where the following day I'd feel a little bit of discomfort in that SI joint and I'd maybe get a little bit of erector soreness, but I was like, hey, I'm happy with some erector soreness. It's not so uncomfortable, it's a problem. But there was that point of which I did my straight leg deadlifts and then I went to a leg press and I allowed also on my leg press for my hips and lower back maybe to move a little bit more than they should in such a scenario where the lower back is already a little bit sensitive. And so it was after I did that, the next morning I was super stiff and it was painful. So in the short term, I modified things heavily to just work around the injury. So for example, like I said with my client, his back is sore at the moment. So just like do lying leg curls. So I'd kind of make up the volume through isolation movements so that I was still getting the stimulus through the muscle, but not making the injury worse. And something Mike is very big on is continuing to move that tissue and work through, like with things and meet pain, but don't work through it. And yeah, he's very keen on keeping things mobile and moving and still being able to meet your bodybuilding objectives and goals within training, but just being smart about exercise selection. And there's many ways you can modify even an exercise in terms of load, range of motion, tempo. And so when I reintroduced the deadlifts and also leg press, I did modify things. So with the RDLs, I started to reduce range of motion. So I just came down until I felt like I lost the arch of my lower back, which meant I came basically midway between my shin, and I maintained that, and I'm still using that. I also modified, as I've progressed and felt more confident with the lower back, I have allowed this to speed up, but my tempo, I slowed down. I added a pause in the lengthened position there. So that's kind of gone at this stage where I've been able to progress things. And I worked with a slightly higher rep range at the time. So where I was typically 5 to 10 reps, I went to 10 to 15 to lower the loads. So basically load being lighter, helping less range of motion, bit more control on the lift with the tempo adjustment. And now I've got to 5 to 10 rep range again, but I've maintained that lower range of motion because I think it was the range of motion that caused the issue. And the same on the leg press. I was allowing my heels to rise, I had my feet lower on the platform. I was allowing my hips to rise a little bit more. And so I moved my feet up a little bit higher. I put yoga blocks behind my lower back to make sure that that wasn't occurring anymore. And I paused in that deep position as well to have a bit more control. So most of those modifications have still held. And ever since I made those, I could go back to the previous leg press technique. That would be fine, probably. But at this stage of prep, the risk of injury, I don't want any risk of injury. I want to be very safe. And so I know the body is resilient. And that's part of where Mike's like, hey, continue to train. We can work around it. Meet pain, don't push through it. We can modify these variables to move forward. And then he also gave me some, I guess, rehab work that was just like stretching and mobilizing the joints that were impacted, which definitely helped in the short term. I haven't really kept those going now because I don't know if you really have to longer term to make sure that these things aren't occurring. I don't think there was any like lack of mobility or stuff like this that was really causing the issue, or tightness within muscles. I think it was just using an excessive range of motion and really progressing that quite hard that just led to it. And I think this happens. I think that's the philosophy I have with injuries and things is you can manage fatigue as best you can. You can train with the best technique you can. But when you train hard in the gym, over and over, you look to progressively overload, an injury is going to happen at some stage. Hopefully it's nothing career ending. It shouldn't be if you're doing things smart. It's probably just going to be a niggle that, such as in my situation, after a month, it's completely forgotten about and you're good on your way again. So yeah, that's some of the philosophies and lessons that I took from that experience.
So quota-based approach rather than pain contingent. And I guess one of those things was that you talked about was with Michael Chalice. You kind of came up with a pre-exhaust approach where you would employ some exercises to pre-fatigue the hamstrings or the gluteals, the posterior chain before doing your RDLs. Is this something you're still doing? And given what we were talking about at the start about RIR and training intensity and your low amount of volume that you're putting through your legs each week, has that influenced how your training is structured?
I think I tried that very short term and it didn't solve the issue. So I don't currently still do that. I just do my RDLs straight up. I'm actually not doing any pre-fatigue things at the moment in terms of I don't do like leg extensions before leg press or any kind of isolation movement before a compound movement. It's not something I've done a lot of. I never really find it makes that much difference personally. And I have a little bit of a bias towards making sure on those big compound lifts to be as fresh as possible, to be able to give them my all, because I think they give you such good bang per buck. And as a natural who's not that strong, don't think it's as useful a tool as someone who's enhanced, who may be shifting crazy loads. And it's just like, hey, they need to do whatever they can to use the lightest loads possible. But I don't know if it's as important a thing to worry about as a natural lifter. Yeah. That's just my bias though.
No, I understand what you're saying. Like you look at videos of Ronnie Coleman and you can see where Ronnie's at the moment, but I guess the amount of toll that the weight that he was lifting for his A1s, heavy back squats and that kind of thing, the influence over time. I guess you wouldn't see too many natural athletes pushing that kind of weight. And so pre-exhaust may not have the same usefulness in that context. One of the things though that I think would be very relevant to a lot of the listeners is the whole concept around shocking the muscles into growth. And this is one thing I remember all throughout my university years training in my neighbor's backyard gym. And there was always, they didn't have the same level of, I guess you say, like bodybuilding or training literacy in terms of understanding about what they were doing, but, doing preacher curls and saying, oh, we're shocking the muscles today by doing a different exercise than we did last week. I guess a lot of what we know now about hypertrophy research shows that training within a certain range of reps in reserve, progressively overloading the muscle over time, picking exercises that work for you, that you can really cling on to and develop your skill set in and get comfortable with is the best way to build muscle over time. But I guess debunking that idea of muscle confusion that it often, when you're new to the gym, it might be something that you're quite familiar with. But again, you've done a video on this, which I found was very interesting and useful for a lot of people, no doubt. Do you want to maybe delve into more into that concept and what you discussed in that video about how frequently and how often you should be changing exercises and whether you can actually, shock the muscle?
For sure. Yeah, I think it's now as someone who's been in the industry for as long as we have and part of like more the skeptical evidence-based like sphere, when we see something shocking and confusing, we're just like, these are just buzz terms that sell to that new trainee. And it's unfortunate because it can harm them for sure. And when I just think about logically, like when is confusing the body, when has that ever been a good thing? And people like to try and outsmart the body, and you really can't. It's very adaptive to what you give it, and shocking as well. It's, in a sense, shocking is similar to novelty, which has been spoken about as like helping gains. I am skeptical of that as well to some extent, but I think there is something there from like just personal experience and from like bodybuilders as a whole. But yeah, to talk about this subject kind of a little bit more systematically. So yeah, the idea of kind of confusing the body. So changing up exercises very regularly, changing rep ranges very regularly. The unfortunate thing with that is, as you said, we need to overload a muscle and then we want to progressively overload that. But if we're changing things regularly, it's going to be really challenging to do that because there is also a learning curve that takes place, especially for more complex compound lifts, especially when you're more novice. It's harder to learn these. So you could always just go through learning. So you might learn it for a month and then you switch it to shock things and then learn another movement, but you've never actually progressively overloaded. And so you might not actually have grown the muscle tissue that you wanted to because you haven't actually caused that stress. You've just caused a learning response. And so if you keep doing that, you're just going to keep relearning patterns and not actually progressing them. For more isolation lifts, for more advanced trainees, they bicep curls a bicep curl. Like if I take a bicep curl to failure today and then a different one next week, they're both going to be overloading. They're both going to cause a growth response. But if I'm doing a hack squat and then next week a barbell back squat, I'm going to be just keep, like I'm not actually going to be able to progressively overload it because I'll just keep bouncing between relearning exercises and not see that progressive element. So it's important to keep, especially more complex lifts, especially the more novice you are, lifts in for extended periods of time to make sure you're able to cause that progressive overload of adding reps and load and hitting new personal bests over time. Those personal bests are a sign that you've caused and generated growth. It's not that the personal best is what you must achieve to see the growth. It's just a sign that you've done what you should be doing. But if you change things too regularly, then yeah, you'll just find that you're spin your wheels essentially, and that's the big problem there. And it's not like the body becomes very adapted to a movement super quickly. It takes a long time to become adapted. So yeah, you want to keep things in long enough to be able to make sure you're past the learning curve and into progressive overload and really generating that stress response that's going to cause a growth response, and then stay there as long as you can.
And one of the interesting things I think you touched on was the fact that switching exercises due to the fact that you may be growing bored or losing motivation with a specific exercise is a good reason to switch exercises. But what I think I find too frequently is a lot of beginning lifters or those that are at the start of their journey in bodybuilding or fitness or training, they switch, as you say, too frequently. Might be week to week, they're changing exercises due to boredom versus, say, an athlete who's been following a specific program for a number of weeks and then is switching their program due to losing motivation with specific movement patterns. Where's kind of the line you draw there between, switching because of boredom, if it's week to week, or trying to shock the muscle versus actually understanding when you're losing motivation and when it's starting to impair your performance?
That's a really good point. What I would say is for the person who needs a little bit more novelty and a little bit more change, I would say try and find that elsewhere within the program versus those core compound lifts that we're trying to progressively track over time.
Yeah.
Exactly. So like, yeah, switch up that bicep curl, switch up the lying leg curl and seated leg curl. But that RDL, that barbell bench press, like that pull up, we're keeping those core lifts in there as long as we can. And yeah, they might be boring, but there's lots of boring things in life that we do, like brushing our teeth. But we make sure to do those because we know they're important for the result that we want. And so that's what I try and reinforce with that person is like, hey, we'll find that novelty and spice and interest and excitement elsewhere, but we need to be doing these core compound lifts. They're the things that's really driving results, and just explaining that to them in that sort of situation. That's how I tend to go about it with them. And more advanced trainees, they tend, or at least my experience is, I get to a lift that I've been doing for a long time and it's pretty much stalled, and I will run it for a while whilst it's stalled. And then I'll get to a point where I'm like, I psychologically can't deal with this stall anymore. I need to switch it up. And in fact, that might be later than that's even necessary to switch it. It might be that it's as soon as it's like plateaued and you're a bit bored of it, it's been a few months, you could rotate it in and out, because especially as an advanced trainee, again, your ability to learn new technique is like, it'll take a couple of weeks, you'll be right back in that overload zone and you'll be okay. So I'm not even confident that there's like a need to have to push it and milk it that long, but I'm more confident in that than I am in changing it a little bit more frequently.
But like you said, switching from MyFitnessPal to another calorie tracking app, there's obviously switching costs that come with different decisions you're making around your health and your fitness. So in the context of training and say switching from a front squat to a back squat, switching from a sissy squat on, like the variation we were talking about before, you were using a cable, to say doing a sissy squat variation using a Smith where you put your feet forward more and you're kind of dropping into a larger range of hip and knee flexion. What are some examples of when you should change different movement pattern variations in the context of a training program that maybe you've experienced in the past, say with like squatting variations or hip hinge patterns?
Good question. Yeah, I think I'll come back to this because I think it's just such a good overarching principle when you understand it with SFR, so stimulus fatigue ratio.
Yeah.
I always say SFR is your guiding star. It's so cringy, but like it does guide so many decision-making processes like this. So in terms of short-term proxies, I think are all right. Some of these short-term proxies with pump. So how like full and pumped is the muscle getting like a balloon, and then stimulus. So how much local fatigue are we driving? How much disruption are you feeling within that target muscle? I think initially you're always going to get those a bit high because it's novel, it's different. So the body, like it feels very responsive. But if those have got to like a plateau and then started to drop off, so now you're getting even worse stimulus proxies, that's not a great sign, especially if that's accompanied by the fatigue costs of niggles, injuries, joint tissue disruption and discomfort. If those are starting to drop off, so your SFR is dropping off, that's not a great sign. And that's an indication that you might want to rotate it. And then probably the most black and white one is progress. So if you have been repeating performance for a number of weeks, that's probably a sign that, hey, it might be worth rotating it. But I kind of need both to make me sure that I want to rotate it. Because if it's still providing me a great stimulus and low fatigue cost, but it's plateaued, I'm just like, hey, I just need to run this out because eventually I'm providing the stimulus I need. It's providing me a growth response because I'm meeting all the thresholds for growth in terms of volume, proximity to failure. It's just a matter of time until my body's going to adapt and I'm going to see that, hey, all this hard work is paid off. But if I'm seeing a plateau and the SFR is dropping off, that's when I'm concerned. But if the SFR is dropping off and it's progressing, I'm like, maybe I actually want to keep this in for a bit longer. So long as the fatigue cost isn't too high, it's not causing problems, I'll keep it going. So I kind of need to see that combo of SFR's poor and it's plateaued. Once I've seen those two together, it makes sense to me to switch it out for something new.
Yeah. I like the analogy you used too about if it's not broken, don't fix it. But when that doesn't always hold true. And when you were talking about how you always keep different exercises tools and you don't discredit one or the other, they're all tools, but sometimes it's about picking the best tool for the job. Sometimes it's not just about, if you're doing the right things, there may be a better tool to help you progress forward. So again, one of those kind of concepts which in the past I've thought about, if it's broken, don't fix it, but more so of a, how can we improve the training program as opposed to maintaining consistency with this is something you've thought about a lot recently, and how have you incorporated that in your training?
Yeah, it's that saying I think is really good, but it's not perfect. Because if you're seeing progress, why change anything? The reason to change it is if you could see better progress. And that's essentially it. Like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But what if it's not broken, but could be just so much more, like so far superior? It's like, I don't know, my mobile phone works of 5 years old. Like I can make calls, I can go on the internet, but it's really slow and it often turns itself off. Well, it's not broken clearly, but it's pretty inefficient and not effective. If you've got a new upgraded phone, hey, now you're going to be more efficient, more effective. So I think it's important to recognize that as well and just be like looking at your results and what you're getting from something and be like, so is it broken? No, but is it providing me the best results I could possibly have? Assess that. And that can be hard to assess. I think it's more of an advanced person's problem versus novice, because if something's progressing, it's probably progressing pretty damn well. But then you would look at some of these like more finer details of, okay, what is it providing me? How's it feeling? How am I enjoying it? And then you can kind of see if something else could work better and experiment. That's one of the key things. I'm always like, frequency is one of the things that's easiest to experiment with. We know if we keep basically volume through the week the same, frequency is just something to have a play around with. So you could try higher frequencies, lower frequencies, and see how that influences results. Even if it's just psychologically, it's more enjoyable or more adherable to do it a certain way. Yeah, that's definitely something that I think is useful for people to think about, especially as they get more advanced. Because when you're a novice, again, so many things work. It's just good to be consistent and adherent to things. But as you get more advanced, fewer things are going to work, especially particularly well. And so it's worth experimenting a little bit to see if you can get more from something else.
And in that process of improvement, throughout the years of you producing content, it seems like you've become very fond of different applications and softwares online that can help improve your processes and ultimately your programming and nutrition. One of those that Alberto Nunez kind of drew my attention to was Happy Scale, which I use a lot. But one of those that you mentioned on one of your videos was the Macro Fact app, which I think Jeff Nippard uses, but also examine.com was one of the websites, which I think you did a reel on Instagram about, and comparing different supplements and how reputable they are. Is there any other different applications or software? And I'll put the links to those that I just mentioned in the show notes. But is there any other, software applications or websites that people might find useful if they're, looking to improve their training or nutrition or anything of that nature around their training and lifestyle?
For sure. Yeah, examine.com is fantastic, especially as a practitioner and a coach. You don't know everything about every supplement because there's a lot and it's really challenging to kind of dive into all of that. So I always refer to examine.com. There's some really good guides as well in there in terms of like supplements for fat loss, supplements for sleep, supplements for, they've got loads of different things for testosterone. And you can click in there and they have a guide of like, these are essentially S tier supplements. And then they kind of rank them in how helpful they're going to be. So definitely for supplementation, that's always my go-to place. And it's unbiased as well. They're not sponsored by any supplement company. So it means it's really, really useful in that sense. Another one would be the Mass Research Review. So this is with Eric Helms, Eric Trexler, and what have I forgotten? Mike Zordos, because he's not so present online. So Mike Zordos is there and Lauren as well as over there. And I don't know if they've expanded the team more than that, but that's just amazing because they keep up to date with the latest research, essentially. As a content producer, a podcaster, but as a coach, it's hugely helpful because I always say this, I'm a practitioner first and foremost. I'm not a researcher. I don't know how to read research as well as these guys, and they are very credible in my book. So better for them to read the research, digest it, and look over it than for me to do that. So it's super helpful to have that there and available, and they keep you up to date with things. So again, I'm not keeping up to date with every research paper that comes out. It's very challenging to do that, whereas they talk about all the relevant ones in there. So those would be two really big ones. And of course, like many of the guests on my podcast have their own like research reviews and things. So I know there's Lane Norton has his. I know Bill Campbell has one as well. These are great resources to go through. That Mass Research Review is the one that immediately comes to mind. In terms of like apps and things, I actually really don't use many. I haven't used Macro Factor. I have seen like behind the scenes clips and things of it. And I've had clients also who have used it and they really like it. It seems like it's a really nice app to use, but I haven't really used many outside of, I just use my MyFitnessPal, I use my Google Sheets, and that's mostly all I use. So yeah, I'm pretty boring in that sense.
Old school. No, I like it. I think that works for different people. Everyone's different. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today, Steve. Before we wrap things up, I just wanted to ask you, I see this really strong fixation on, a lot of Dragon Ball Z and Japanese art. Is this something intrigued you and kind of pushed you into bodybuilding as well in those early days. As we were talking about with Brandon Kempter, he had an interest in the superheroes and the comic book characters. But I guess, yeah, with the anime or the Japanese characters there and artwork, is this something that's being passionate about that has pushed you when you look at people like Goku and Vegeta and the muscle mass on those guys and how shredded they are? Has that motivated you to push down that line of bodybuilding?
I wish I could say it was a strong influence because I think that would be cooler. But when I was in secondary school with my still best friend, it was one of the first things we connected on. We were in art class and drawing. I think Piccolo was the character we were drawing. And we just connected on the fact we were drawing that. Neither of us knew anything about the gym. We were too young to even train, but I loved it at that stage. And then I reconnected with Dragon Ball during like a contest prep. So I kind of left all the anime and everything like that during my time at university. And I think I reconnected with it in one of my contest preps. And just like the quotes from Vegeta and like the hardcoreness during the battles and all of those sort of things just really appealed to me. And I love the artwork from it and like the drawings and the different animations. And yeah, it's only over the last really like 5 years I've really started to really like anime and broaden my horizons. I've watched quite a few different, and obviously I'm now like tatted up with various anime on my
I was
arms.
going to ask you what the meaning behind. I recently got a tattoo on my forearm. Obviously, being in the bodybuilding space, you kind of don't want to go and
Yes, forearms.
that. Yeah,
Yeah, I have very little meaning behind mine apart from I think the artwork is really cool.
Yeah.
The animes that I've got Naruto and Dragon Ball. They've driven me through some tough times, and I listen to anime music when I train, and quite often it's like speeches from various kind of clips from those, and they just help drive me forward. And the characters I really relate to in some senses, and they appeal to me. And so, yeah, it's just, I love the artwork and I love the shows. And whenever I see those on my arms, it kind of gives me good feelings. So I just enjoy it from that
I
perspective.
understand you've been through some pretty tough times in the last year or so, like in your personal life. Obviously, not touch on that, but obviously the presence you've been able to build online and the changes you've made in your physique, the way you continue to help people in your coaching, and obviously going through your own battles and things of that nature. It's a credit to you and the content you're putting out. So thanks again, Steve, for coming on the podcast and for sharing your story, your insights, and all your knowledge. It's been a pleasure, mate.
I appreciate that a lot. Thank you so much for your time as well and great questions.
Thanks for coming on the podcast, mate. I know it went that's probably the longest step, second or third. I think we went about 2 hours with Brandon and Luke Tullich. But other than those, Eric Helms, I could
Nice.
6 hour, but
Yeah. Oh yeah, Eric does talk. I mean, he talks good stuff. So
I just find my brain though, I have to really concentrate and focus where the conversation's going. I've found he's the toughest one I've had to interview because he can just take different pockets of information in the discussion and go a mile with it. And you got to be ready to change direction so quickly.
Yeah, I often have structures in place for guests, and then they've already kind of jumped like halfway through it, and then I need to like jump back, and I'm like, yeah, it can get challenging from that perspective. So I totally get it.
Hey,
I need to jump off.
I'll let
yeah,
you
sorry.
Go. Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks, Steve.
Cheers, man. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Strength Connect podcast. If you enjoyed listening, please don't forget to rate the podcast or subscribe to our YouTube channel for more clips from each episode. You can also follow us on all social media platforms using the handle @Strength Connect.